Martha Thompson's journey began in a small, quiet town in Georgia during the 1950s. Life wasn't easy for her family back then. The world around them was divided by segregation, and opportunities for black families were limited. But Martha's parents had big dreams for their daughter. They worked tirelessly, her father as a mechanic and her mother as a seamstress, to give Martha the best chance at a better life. Her father often said to her, "Martha, don't let anyone tell you what you can or cannot do." Those words stuck with her throughout her life. From a young age, Martha showed an unusual curiosity about how things worked. She loved taking apart old radios and trying to put them back together. Sometimes she succeeded. Other times, she ended up with a pile of parts that didn't quite fit. But every attempt taught her something new. Her parents encouraged this passion, even though they couldn't afford fancy tools or expensive gadgets. "You've got brains and hands," her mother would say. "That's all you need." School became Martha's escape from the harsh realities of the outside world. While many kids struggled to focus, Martha soaked up knowledge like a sponge. Teachers noticed her sharp mind and encouraged her to aim high. Math and science quickly became her favorite subjects. By the time she graduated high school, she had earned scholarships to attend a prestigious university, a rare feat for someone from her background. At college, Martha faced new challenges. She was one of only a handful of black students, and some professors doubted her ability simply because of the color of her skin. But instead of letting their skepticism discourage her, Martha used it as fuel to prove them wrong. Late nights in the library and long hours in the lab paid off when she graduated at the top of her class with a degree in electrical engineering. But Martha wasn't done yet. She knew she wanted to make a difference, not just build machines. So she went back to school and earned another degree in business administration. This combination of technical skill and entrepreneurial insight set her apart. It also opened doors that once seemed impossible to unlock. Her first job was at a tech startup in California. At first, colleagues underestimated her, assuming she wouldn't last long in the fast-paced environment. But Martha surprised everyone. Her innovative ideas helped solve problems no one else could crack. Within a few years, she climbed the ranks and started making waves in Silicon Valley, a place dominated by men who looked nothing like her. Despite her growing success, Martha never forgot where she came from. She remembered the sting of being treated differently because of her race and gender. These experiences shaped her worldview and gave her a deep sense of empathy for others facing similar struggles. Little did she know, these lessons would prepare her for a moment decades later, a moment when she would face discrimination again, but this time with the power to fight back. As Martha grew older, her reputation soared. She founded companies that pushed boundaries, created jobs, and changed industries. People admired her not just for her brilliance, but also for her kindness and determination. Yet beneath her calm exterior lay a fire ready to ignite if provoked. And soon enough, life would test her resolve in ways she never imagined. Martha's rise in the world of technology was nothing short of extraordinary. After years of hard work and determination, she founded her first company, a small startup focused on improving aviation safety systems. At the time, the aviation industry relied heavily on outdated technology, and accidents caused by mechanical failures were far too common. Martha saw an opportunity to make a difference, not just for airlines, but for passengers whose lives depended on these systems working flawlessly. Her big breakthrough came when she developed a groundbreaking AI-powered diagnostic tool. This system could predict potential aircraft malfunctions before they happened, saving both time and lives. It was a game changer, and soon, major airlines began knocking on her door. Her company, Airline Technologies, quickly grew from a tiny office with a handful of employees to a global powerhouse with offices around the world. Investors poured money into her vision, recognizing that Martha wasn't just building a business, she was reshaping an entire industry. By her early 50s, Martha had become one of the most respected figures in Silicon Valley. But success didn't come without its challenges. As a black woman in a field dominated by men, she often faced skepticism and resistance. Some competitors dismissed her ideas, claiming they were too ambitious or unrealistic. Others tried to take credit for her innovations, yet Martha refused to let negativity slow her down. Instead, she used it as motivation to push harder and prove her critics wrong. Over the next 2 decades, Martha expanded her influence beyond Airline. She invested in other promising startups, particularly those led by women and people of color. She believed in lifting others up, knowing firsthand how difficult it could be to break through barriers. Her portfolio included companies working on everything from renewable energy to advanced robotics. By the age of 72, Martha had amassed not only a personal fortune, but also a reputation as a visionary leader who cared deeply about making the world a better place. Despite her immense wealth and power, Martha remained humble. She drove an old sedan, wore simple clothes, and lived in the same modest home she purchased decades earlier. Friends often teased her about upgrading to something fancier, but Martha simply laughed. "I don't need fancy things to feel happy," she'd say. "What matters is what you do with what you have." One of her proudest achievements was becoming a trusted advisor to some of the largest airlines in the world. Executives sought her advice on everything from technological upgrades to customer service improvements. They admired her ability to see problems clearly and offer practical solutions. Many even called her the guardian angel of aviation, because of how much safer and more efficient planes became thanks to her innovations. But even as Martha reached the height of her career, she never lost sight of the lessons she learned growing up. She remembered the sting of being treated unfairly because of her race and gender. And while she hoped society had moved past such biases, she knew deep down that discrimination still existed. It was just subtler now. Little did she know, she would soon face a painful reminder of this truth herself. What happened next would not only test her patience, but also give her the chance to use her power in ways no one expected. It was supposed to be a routine flight, just like any other. Martha had wrapped up a busy week of meetings and was heading home to San Francisco. She arrived at the gate with plenty of time to spare, dressed comfortably in jeans, a cardigan, and her favorite pair of sneakers. To anyone watching, she looked like an ordinary traveler, perhaps a grandmother visiting family or a retiree enjoying some well-deserved rest. No one would have guessed that this unassuming woman was one of the most influential figures in the aviation industry. As boarding began, Martha settled into her seat near the window. She placed her carry-on bag, a small weathered suitcase, under the seat in front of her and pulled out a book to pass the time. The plane slowly filled with passengers, and soon the hum of conversation filled the cabin. Everything seemed normal until a commotion broke out a few rows behind her. A man seated nearby began complaining loudly about Martha's bag. "That thing looks suspicious," he said, pointing toward it. His voice carried through the aisle, drawing attention from other passengers and crew members. Some people turned to look, their expressions curious or uneasy. Others shrugged it off, assuming it was just another overreaction in today's hyper-vigilant world. But the situation escalated quickly. A flight attendant approached Martha and asked her to step off the plane so security could inspect her belongings. Confused and embarrassed, Martha complied, knowing there was no point in arguing. As she gathered her things and walked down the narrow aisle, whispers followed her. Passengers stared, some with pity, others with suspicion. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Once off the plane, Martha waited as airport security officers examined her bag. They rifled through her clothes, papers, and toiletries, searching for anything that might justify the accusation. But they found nothing. No weapons, no contraband, not even anything remotely unusual. Still, the damage was done. By the time the all-clear was given, the plane had already finished boarding and begun taxiing to the runway without her. Standing there alone, Martha felt a mix of emotions: anger, humiliation, and disbelief. How could this happen? She had spent decades working to make air travel safer and more efficient, yet here she was being treated like a criminal simply because someone didn't like the way her bag looked. The irony wasn't lost on her. In that moment, Martha realized this wasn't just about her. It was about something much bigger. It was about the biases and prejudices that still lingered in society, often hidden but always ready to surface when least expected. Though she tried to stay calm, the incident left a deep mark on her. As she made her way back to the terminal, Martha knew this wasn't going to end here. Something inside her stirred, a quiet determination to ensure that what happened to her wouldn't happen to anyone else. Little did the airline know, their actions that day were about to set off a chain reaction that would shake the entire industry to its core. The incident on the plane left Martha feeling a mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and disbelief. But as she sat alone in the terminal waiting for her rebooked flight, something else began to take root: resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of how they looked or where they came from. Martha knew she couldn't let this moment pass without doing something meaningful. By the time she landed in San Francisco, news of the incident had already spread. A passenger on the plane had recorded part of the confrontation and posted it online. Within hours, the video went viral, sparking outrage across social media. People were quick to point out the obvious racial undertones of the situation. Comments flooded in, many expressing support for Martha, but also sharing their own experiences of being profiled while traveling. Some called it an example of systemic racism. Others labeled it outright discrimination. The hashtag #JusticeForMartha started trending worldwide. As the story gained traction, journalists reached out to Martha for interviews. At first, she hesitated. Public attention wasn't something she craved, and she worried about turning her personal pain into a spectacle. But then she realized this was an opportunity, a chance to shine a light on an issue that affected far too many people. So she agreed to speak up, not just for herself, but for everyone who had faced similar injustices. During one interview, Martha spoke candidly about what happened. "I've dedicated my life to making air travel safer and more accessible," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "And yet, here I am, treated like someone who doesn't belong on a plane simply because of the color of my skin. This isn't just about me. It's about the kind of world we want to live in." Her words resonated deeply with millions of viewers. Praise poured in from all corners, from civil rights activists to everyday citizens who admired her grace under pressure. Even some employees of the airline expressed regret privately, saying they wished they could have handled the situation differently. But not everyone was supportive. Critics dismissed the incident as overblown, arguing that mistakes happen and that Martha should move on. To them, she replied firmly, "If this can happen to me, a woman who has worked with airlines for decades, imagine what happens to those without my resources or influence." Behind the scenes, Martha began formulating a plan. She knew public shaming wouldn't be enough to create real change. What the airline, and the entire industry, needed was accountability. And as a major investor in several carriers, including the one responsible for her removal, Martha had the power to demand exactly that. She spent days reviewing contracts, financial reports, and investment agreements. Her research revealed that Skyline Airways, the airline involved, relied heavily on funding earmarked for modernizing its aging fleet. Much of that money came directly from Martha's investments through Aerolink Technologies. Without it, the airline would struggle to stay competitive in an already cutthroat market. An idea began to form, one bold enough to shake the aviation world to its core. By the end of the week, Martha made her decision. She would withdraw $800 million in funding earmarked for Skyline's fleet upgrades unless the company took immediate steps to address systemic discrimination within its operations. For Martha, this wasn't about revenge. It was about sending a clear message. Companies that fail to treat their customers and employees fairly don't deserve support, no matter how big or powerful they are. What happened next would send shockwaves through Wall Street and force the airline industry to confront uncomfortable truths. But for now, Martha allowed herself a small smile. After years of breaking barriers and proving doubters wrong, she was ready to fight another battle. Only this time, the stakes were higher than ever, and the outcome would affect millions. Martha's announcement sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. At a high-profile board meeting of Airline Technologies, she stood tall, her calm demeanor masking the storm she was about to unleash. With reporters and executives watching closely, Martha declared her decision. She would withdraw $800 million in funding earmarked for Skyline Airways' fleet modernization project. Her reasoning was simple yet powerful. Companies that fail to address discrimination don't deserve her support. The room fell silent as her words sank in. Executives exchanged nervous glances, their faces pale with disbelief. For Skyline Airways, this was nothing short of a disaster. The airline had been counting on that money to replace its aging planes with newer, more fuel-efficient models. Without it, they risked falling behind competitors and losing millions in potential revenue. Investors began panicking, and by the end of the day, Skyline's stock price plummeted, wiping out billions in market value. News of Martha's bold move spread like wildfire. Headlines blared across newspapers and TV networks. Tech titan pulls funding over discrimination scandal. Analysts scrambled to predict the fallout, while industry insiders debated whether Martha's actions were justified or too extreme. Some praised her courage, calling her a trailblazer for using financial leverage to demand accountability. Others criticized her, claiming her decision would hurt not just Skyline, but also innocent employees who relied on the airline for their livelihoods. But Martha didn't back down. In interviews, she explained her position clearly. "This isn't personal vengeance," she said. "It's about holding companies accountable for their actions. If we keep rewarding bad behavior, nothing will ever change." She emphasized that her goal wasn't to destroy Skyline. It was to push them, and the entire industry, toward meaningful reform. To prove her point, she laid out specific demands: mandatory anti-bias training for all staff, transparent investigations into cases of discrimination, and measurable diversity goals for leadership positions. Skyline's executives knew they couldn't ignore Martha's ultimatum. Desperate to salvage their reputation and their finances, they issued a public apology within hours of her announcement. "We deeply regret the treatment Ms. Thompson experienced," the statement read. "Her concerns have highlighted areas where we must improve, and we are committed to making lasting changes." But Martha wasn't satisfied with empty promises. She insisted on concrete action, setting a 90-day deadline for Skyline to implement her proposed reforms. If they failed to meet her expectations, the funding withdrawal would remain in place indefinitely. This gave the airline little room to maneuver. Reluctantly, Skyline agreed to her terms, knowing failure to comply could spell financial ruin. Meanwhile, Martha's decision sparked a broader conversation about equity and inclusion in the aviation industry. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies, fearing similar backlash if discriminatory practices came to light. Civil rights organizations seized the moment, urging companies to take proactive steps to combat bias. Employees, emboldened by Martha's stance, started speaking out about their own experiences of unfair treatment at work. For Martha, this was exactly what she had hoped for. She understood that real change wouldn't happen overnight, but she also knew that moments like these, when the world is watching, create opportunities to push boundaries and challenge the status quo. As she watched the ripple effects of her actions unfold, Martha felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about one incident or one airline. It was about reshaping an entire system to ensure fairness for everyone. Behind closed doors, however, Martha remained laser-focused. She knew the fight was far from over. While Skyline scrambled to meet her demands, she prepared herself for the next phase of her plan. A phase that would go beyond apologies and promises, forcing the industry to confront its deepest flaws head-on. With the world watching, Skyline Airways scrambled to meet Martha's demands. The airline's executives worked around the clock, consulting diversity experts, drafting new policies, and overhauling training programs. They announced a sweeping initiative called Skyline for All, promising to create a more inclusive environment for both employees and passengers. Anti-bias workshops became mandatory for every staff member, from gate agents to pilots. The company also pledged to hire a chief diversity officer and set measurable goals for increasing representation of women and minorities in leadership roles. At first glance, it seemed like progress. Skyline launched an advertising campaign highlighting their commitment to equality, featuring photos of diverse employees and happy travelers. Reporters praised the airline for taking swift action, and some even suggested Martha's intervention had sparked a turning point for the industry. But Martha wasn't fooled by glossy ads or polished press releases. She knew the real test would be whether these changes translated into tangible results, and she intended to hold them accountable. To ensure transparency, Martha demanded regular updates on Skyline's progress. Every month, the airline submitted detailed reports showing how many employees had completed anti-bias training, how many discrimination complaints had been filed and resolved, and what steps were being taken to diversify leadership teams. Independent auditors reviewed the data to verify its accuracy. If Skyline failed to meet any of the benchmarks Martha had set, the $800 million funding withdrawal would remain in place indefinitely. Other airlines took notice. Fearing similar backlash, competitors began examining their own practices. Delta Airlines introduced a hotline for passengers to report discriminatory behavior, while United rolled out unconscious bias training for customer service staff. Even smaller regional carriers jumped on board, revising hiring processes and hosting community forums to discuss inclusivity. For the first time in decades, the aviation industry was forced to confront systemic issues that had long gone unaddressed. But Martha didn't stop there. She used her platform to amplify voices often ignored in corporate boardrooms. She partnered with civil rights organizations to host town halls where everyday people could share stories of discrimination they'd faced while traveling. These events drew hundreds of participants, from single mothers who'd been racially profiled at security checkpoints to elderly veterans denied proper accommodations on flights. Their testimonies painted a sobering picture of the challenges still facing marginalized communities and reinforced the urgency of Martha's mission. Martha also turned her attention to mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds. She launched a scholarship fund through Airline Technologies to support students pursuing careers in STEM fields. Recipients weren't just given financial aid. They were paired with mentors, including Martha herself, who helped guide them through the challenges of breaking into male-dominated industries. "If I can help even one person avoid the obstacles I faced," she said during a keynote speech, "then all of this will have been worth it." As months passed, Martha began to see signs of genuine change, not just at Skyline but across the entire travel sector. Employees reported feeling more empowered to speak up about unfair treatment, and passengers noted improvements in how complaints were handled. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Some critics argued that Martha's approach was too harsh, claiming it punished companies for isolated incidents rather than systemic problems. Others accused her of grandstanding, suggesting she cared more about headlines than actual reform. But Martha brushed off the criticism. She knew meaningful change rarely came without resistance. What mattered most was the impact. Fewer passengers being profiled, more opportunities for women and minorities in leadership, and a growing awareness of the biases that shaped so much of daily life. And though the road ahead remained long, Martha felt confident that the foundation for lasting transformation had been laid. Still, as the dust settled and the media moved on to other stories, Martha couldn't shake the feeling that her work was far from done. There were still battles to fight, systems to dismantle, and lives to uplift. Little did anyone know, she was already planning her next move, a move that would extend her influence far beyond the aviation industry. Martha's impact stretched far beyond the aviation industry, reaching corners of society she hadn't initially anticipated. Her bold stand against Skyline Airways became a catalyst for conversations about discrimination and inclusion in industries ranging from technology to retail. Major corporations began examining their own practices, realizing that what happened to Skyline could easily happen to them if they ignored systemic inequities. CEOs suddenly found themselves asking tough questions. Were their workplaces truly inclusive? Did their policies protect employees and customers from bias? And perhaps most importantly, were they doing enough to foster diversity at every level? The ripple effect was undeniable. Retail giants like Walmart and Target announced initiatives to improve hiring practices for minority candidates. Tech companies, many of which had long struggled with diversity, committed to publishing annual reports on workforce demographics. Even Hollywood got involved, with studios pledging to hire more women and people of color both in front of and behind the camera. It seemed as though Martha's actions had ignited a global movement, one that demanded accountability not just in words, but in measurable outcomes. Civil rights organizations hailed Martha as a hero, crediting her with forcing businesses to confront uncomfortable truths. She didn't just pull funding. She pulled back the curtain, said one activist during a televised panel discussion. Her courage reminded us all that power can, and should, be used for justice. Inspired by her example, grassroots campaigns sprang up across the country, encouraging consumers to support companies that prioritized fairness and boycott those that didn't. For Martha, this widespread awakening was deeply gratifying, but it also came with new responsibilities. She received countless letters and emails from people sharing how her story had inspired them to take action in their own lives. A young woman wrote to thank her for proving that standing up to injustice could lead to real change. An elderly man described how he'd been emboldened to file a complaint after years of enduring racism at his local grocery store. Each message reinforced Martha's belief that individual acts of courage could spark collective progress. Determined to keep the momentum going, Martha launched a foundation dedicated to combating discrimination in all its forms. The Martha Thompson Equity Fund provided grants to nonprofits working on issues like voter suppression, workplace inequality, and access to education. She also created a mentorship program specifically for women of color entering STEM fields, ensuring that future generations would have opportunities she once fought so hard to secure. Her influence even reached policymakers. Lawmakers introduced legislation aimed at addressing racial profiling in public spaces, citing Martha's ordeal as a case study of why such laws were needed. Airports began implementing stricter guidelines for handling passenger complaints, while advocacy groups pushed for greater oversight of security procedures. Slowly but surely, systems that had long favored the privileged started to shift. Yet despite her growing fame, Martha remained grounded. She continued to live modestly, eschewing luxury cars and designer clothes in favor of simplicity. When asked about her legacy, she often said, "I'm not doing this for recognition. I'm doing it because it's right." Still, she couldn't deny the sense of fulfillment that came from knowing her efforts had touched so many lives. As time went on, Martha's story became a symbol of resilience and justice, a reminder that no matter who you are or where you come from, your voice matters. But for Martha, the work was never truly finished. There were always more barriers to break, more hearts and minds to change. Little did the world know, she was quietly planning her next chapter, one that would extend her mission even further, ensuring that the fight for equality would continue. Years passed, and Martha Thompson's story became the stuff of legend. What had started as a humiliating incident on a plane transformed into a movement that reshaped industries and inspired millions. Though she never sought fame, her name became synonymous with resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what is right. People spoke of her not just as a tech pioneer or business magnate, but as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, one person can make a difference. Martha herself remained humble about her impact. In interviews, she often downplayed her role, saying, "I didn't do anything special. I simply refused to stay silent when something was wrong." But those who followed her journey knew better. Her actions weren't just about withdrawing funding from an airline. They were about challenging systems that perpetuated inequality. She had shown the world that money and influence could be used not just to build wealth, but to create meaningful change. As Martha grew older, she reflected on her life with a mix of pride and gratitude. She thought about her parents, who had instilled in her the values of hard work and determination. She remembered the long nights spent tinkering with radios as a child, the countless rejections she faced early in her career, and the moments when she doubted whether she belonged in rooms full of people who didn't look like her. Those experiences had shaped her into the woman she became, a woman unafraid to use her voice and her resources to fight for fairness. Her legacy extended far beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. Statues honoring her contributions were erected at airports around the world, each one inscribed with the words, "For justice, for equality, for all." Schools began teaching her story in history classes, framing it as a turning point in the ongoing struggle against discrimination. Young entrepreneurs looked to her as proof that success wasn't just about making money. It was about leaving the world better than you found it. Even in retirement, Martha stayed active. She traveled the globe, speaking at conferences and mentoring the next generation of leaders. Her message was always the same. Don't let anyone tell you your dreams are too big or your voice too small. The world needs more people willing to stand up and say, "This isn't right." Her words resonated deeply, especially among young women and minorities who saw themselves in her story. Though Martha eventually passed away at the age of 92, her influence lived on. The Martha Thompson Equity Fund continued to support initiatives aimed at dismantling systemic barriers, while the mentorship program she founded helped launch the careers of hundreds of aspiring innovators. Her company, Airline Technologies, remained a leader in aviation safety, guided by the principles she had championed throughout her life. In the end, Martha's greatest achievement wasn't the businesses she built or the wealth she accumulated. It was the lives she touched. She taught the world that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. And she proved that true power lies not in domination, but in lifting others up. Today, whenever passengers walk through terminals adorned with her likeness, they're reminded of the elderly black woman who once stood up to injustice and won. Her story serves as a timeless lesson. No matter how daunting the odds may seem, progress is possible when we refuse to back down. For Martha Thompson, that was a legacy worth fighting for.